Welcome to the show. I'm Peter Zablocki, and today I'm thrilled to be speaking with award winning historian and author Sarah Pearsall. In her groundbreaking new book, Freedom Around the Globe, A World History of the American Revolution, Sarah challenges everything that we think we know about 1776. Instead of the familiar story of the founding fathers and the 13 colonies, she reveals the American Revolution as a truly global event, one that rippled across India, West Africa, China, the West Indies, Europe, and beyond. Through vivid stories of tax protests in Calcutta, Edinburgh philosophers, German boy soldiers, indigenous nations, and countless friends of liberty, Sarah shows us how the revolutionary spirit was never confined to just one nation, and how the 13 colonies actually made up less than half of Britain's empire at the time. As we approach the 250th anniversary of American independence, this conversation offers a fresh and sometimes surprising look at what freedom, empire, and revolution really meant, and still mean today. I hope you guys enjoy. Well, Sarah, welcome to History Shorts.
Hi, nice to be here.
So we chatted a little bit before I click record. I feel like we're just continuing our conversation. I'm going to ask you the obvious question. How did this story come to be? Were you just sitting there like, oh, why don't I do this? Or was this more like, I'm going to do this one day kind of thing?
It actually came out of my teaching, and in the wake of sort of 2016 and two pretty divisive elections in both the United Kingdom, I was then teaching at Cambridge University in England, and in the US. I had a lot of students who were baffled by the US nation state and sort of issues about nations and nationalism more broadly. So I decided to teach a year-long course on the American Revolution. But to be honest, I had taught such courses in the past, but a lot of the literature seemed fairly familiar. It didn't seem exciting to me. So I was sort of trying to think about ways to make it more interesting, honestly, to myself. Um, and what I decided to do was to teach a course, sort of thinking about the American Revolution in a wider international context. And once I started teaching the course, I discovered an extraordinary array of connections that even I, who had studied and taught and researched in this area for years, wasn't familiar with. And once I started talking to people about it, colleagues and others, they would say, "Wow, that sounds really interesting." And then one of them eventually said, "Maybe you should write a book." And I was like, "Huh, hadn't really thought about that." But then I did start thinking about it, and I obviously did write the book. I still teach the class now at Johns Hopkins University. So I sort of continue to have that sort of bounce of presenting these ideas and the kind of thrill of discovering material together with students. And I've tried to bring that across in the book a little bit.
Yeah, you mentioned that in the book that one of your students was like, "How did we get here?" It's one of those questions that we often get from our students, and it's interesting how it was a conversation with a student that got you to be like, "Well, actually," and it leads
Right.
to a
Right.
book,
Right.
right?
Right. And that was unexpected. And in sort of going over discovering the material, finding the material to present to students, and that sort of led me into just sort of unexpected and interesting sets of connections that really just became quite electrifying and were really wonderful for the students and for me. So that's what I've tried to sort
Awesome.
of capture here.
So we're looking at like pretending it's a drone, and what you're doing is you're looking at the tried and true because we like you mentioned in your book too. There is how we know the American Revolution, which is Lexington and Concord. You have all these places, right? Philadelphia, but you
Mhm.
take this drone and you just go out, 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 and it's almost like now you're in space and the globe, it starts spinning. Can you maybe walk us through how some of these imperial decisions that we know to have affected Americans um, were kind of linked grievances around the world? Can you maybe elaborate on that a little bit?
They were. So, people know that the tea in what became known as the Boston Tea Party obviously was from Asia. Um, but the sort of ramifications of what that tea meant and why it had the sort of symbolic freight that it did to Americans in 1773 has a lot to do with events in Asia. And one place that I talk about is Kolkata in India, which was where the East India Company really established itself very firmly and had actually become the de facto ruler of Bengal in the 1760s. And this transformation, what people actually in India called a revolution, people called at the time a revolution, had taken place there. This was a complete transformation of the government, putting the English East India Company, which is a private company with sort of some government backing, about 250 civil servants in charge of an area, a landmass 3 times as large as England itself, with millions of people in it. And that transformation, that revolution, prompted a lot of thinking about the nature of government, and that the nature of that thinking was really put under pressure because a terrible drought began in 1769 that led to a devastating famine in 1770. And this devastating famine killed millions of Bengalis. And it was partly the sort of poor policies of the EIC that exacerbated that famine, and that many South Asians protested and felt was to be laid at the feet of the English East India Company. I knew about that story, but I didn't know that many colonial Americans were very aware of what was going on in Bengal, that there are newspaper accounts, letters, and other things that are appearing in colonial newspapers, and that there is a sense that the EIC is a sort of corrupt corporation, that it was being floated by the British government, which it was with the Tea Act of 1773, which was essentially a way to bail out the EIC, which had financial problems in this period, partly because of things like the famine and an overextension into sort of Chinese tea markets. The EIC had a surplus of Chinese tea that they wanted to sell. And so the Tea Act was partly to help them be able to sell it for lower tariffs to American consumers. But because Americans were aware of what the EIC had done in South Asia, they're very nervous about the EIC. And they actually say explicitly, which I hadn't expected to find, that they see what the EIC has done in Asia and they worry that it's about to do the same in America. And people like John Dickinson, who's much more famous for Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer, which he writes in the late 1760s, writes also 2 letters on the tea tax, where he really argues that this is the EIC's kind of evil plan is to take over America and to treat Americans the way they had treated Asians. And this sense that the EIC is to be rejected, that it's sort of this corrupt monopoly, is really one of the drivers of what becomes known as the Tea Party. So those connections are very um, clear, and there's plenty of evidence for them.
You also stressed the point that the 13 colonies were less than half of Britain's colonies, right? And you even mentioned that in the book when you talk about your students. You asked that question of your students at the beginning of class. Um, what can you maybe tell us why some of these colonies chose to stay loyal to Britain through all these actions, and why some decided, you know what, enough is enough, kind of thing?
Right. So that's a really interesting question. And actually, I think there's a great book to be written called The Other 13 Colonies. I mean, I'm not planning to write it, but I think it's a great idea. Someone should do it. I think that I mean, there are at least double this number. You could count them slightly differently depending on how you count the islands and so on. But it's always a revelation. It's generally a revelation to my undergraduates that there were at least 26 North American British colonies, never mind also colonies like Kolkata elsewhere. So, in fact, many more. And these colonies include what's now Canada. They include many places in the Caribbean, including really important colonies like Jamaica and Barbados. It also includes East and West Florida, which are much larger land masses than the current state of Florida, but essentially that whole sort of southeast corner, and along the sort of Gulf of Mexico. And this moment, some of these are long-standing colonies dating back to the 17th century, like Barbados. Some are much newer British colonies taken over from the Spanish at the end of the Seven Years' War, like the Floridas. These are places that have their own momentum, and they do often have people in them who support rebellion. And there are protests against things like the stamp tax, from Canada all the way down to the Caribbean, in the Floridas as well. But they don't end up joining. And I think recapturing that and sort of why different places take some of the different paths that they do is one of the things that I try to do in this book. So to take Quebec, which again had been a French colony that was taken over by the British at the end of the Seven Years' War. Um, there's every reason for Americans to think the Canadians will join their rebellion. There's no love lost between these French Canadians and the British Empire, right? Um, and they offer the hand of friendship in 1775. They write a letter to French Canadians, the Continental Congress, and they have it translated into French. They distribute 1,000 copies. They're really making every kind of overture to win alliance with Canadians. But just to kind of secure that alliance, they also decide to invade Canada. The Continental Army does that, and they're initially successful. They take Montreal, but then they get to Quebec. It's December of 1775. George Washington, who is the general for the Continental Army, is aware that the terms of service for his soldiers is going to expire on December 31st, and many of them will go home. So he wants to take advantage of their presence while he has them. Needless to say, Canada in December is not a great prospect for a battle. And they do decide to go ahead with the siege of Quebec in December. It goes ahead on December 31st during a terrible blizzard. And it's an absolute disaster for the Continental Army under the command of General Richard Montgomery, who's an Irish born general. He is killed within a couple hours of the fighting beginning, and about a third of the Americans are taken as prisoners of war. This is essentially such a devastating kind of loss for the Americans that it actually prompts a lot of thinking, including thoughts about independence, which really kind of gain momentum because of this terrible disaster. They realize they really need supplies from other countries because they're very ill supplied, the Continental Army. They don't even have uniforms. Sometimes they're wearing old British uniforms from the previous war, 13 years earlier. So this kind of moment is something that's kind of worth thinking about. The Caribbean, there are also sort of different trajectories there. But I think thinking about the effect of these places on the course of the revolution is what became really interesting to me.
Absolutely. You argue that the American founding fathers didn't really have this unique claim, you might say, on the revolutionary spirit. That this
Mhm.
revolutionary spirit was in other places. You talk about obviously India, West Africa. Can you maybe tell us how these different places or ideas from these different places influenced one another, or influenced the American Revolution, or vice versa? The American Revolution influencing them.
Yes, I mean, I really focus this book Most of the books that are about the American Revolution in a kind of global or international register really focus a lot on the effect of the American Revolution on the world, how it sort of causes a cascade, then leads to things like the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, Latin American revolutions. And what was interesting to me was actually thinking about the effect of the world on the American Revolution. There are a lot of ways in which it affects that. Um, and the sort of origins and cause and progress of the revolution really depend on thinking about, think places like Canada, places like the Caribbean, places like West Africa, South Asia. So I also think it's worth thinking about the fact that there are sort of wider transformations in this 18th century world to do with global trade, to do with education, literacy, communications revolutions, all of these things that are driving a lot of events that maybe have been attributed just to the American Revolution. So we think about happiness, for example, as a kind of key word. The Declaration of Independence begins with the claim about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But it was interesting to me to think about happiness in a wider register. And one of the places I do that is in Edinburgh, Scotland, where a debating society called the Pantheon Society, goes co-ed in 1775. It's an all-male debating society. They begin to allow women at least to attend the debates. Women still don't speak at them, but they're at least allowed to attend and to vote on the debating proposition. And very often, these propositions center around happiness, whether a nation that's barbarous or refined is happier, whether being married or single is a happier state, whether happiness in marriage depends on the husband or the wife. And these kinds of debates about happiness are really central to this age, and they really inform a lot of thinking and debates in this period. And that became interesting to me to think about, what does happiness mean to people in this period? And actually, what I discovered is that there's actually a debate about whether all people can be happy. And in fact, there were people, it's hard for us to recapture this idea, but that the idea was that only some people were sort of sufficiently refined or had a sensible, as they would have put it, or we might say sensitive ability to feel true happiness, and that a peasant or a sort of less refined person could only feel kind of a rough satisfaction, but not true happiness. You had to be a sort of educated elite person to really feel true happiness. When we start to sort of see that, then the sort of claim that everyone has the right to pursue happiness actually looks much more radical than we might tend to think of it today. And we can also see how different kinds of people, including women who are sort of left out of the equation, are not part of the Declaration of Independence writing, of course, are not in the room where it happened, right? And that we see that they're also claiming happiness, and we can sort of think about that larger register. And I think it helps us also to see the Declaration in new ways.
You also your book frames this idea of having these friends of liberty, right?
Mhm.
And you just mentioned some of those friends, but there's also indigenous people. There is German soldiers, right? You kind of show this literally the literal idea of friends of liberty. Are there any of these particular stories of any individuals that kind of stood out to you, or perhaps surprised you as you were like going along doing this research and found these stories?
Oh, there were all kinds of stories that surprised me. And partly, as you say, I do take this kind of panoramic view, but I tried in each chapter to really start with sort of individuals and really follow certain individuals throughout, some of whom are famous, like George Washington, some of whom are far less well known. In fact, I start the book with someone whose name we actually don't even know, but who was executed for killing her master in the Great Lakes area, what is now Detroit. And so I became really interested in tracing these stories. One of the stories that I became really interested in thinking about, especially in terms of ideas about liberty, was actually someone who was taken from the coast of West Africa as a boy, and he was traded for a barrel of rum to a New England minister who subsequently kept a diary throughout the American Revolution. The boy becomes named Newport, which is where he first was taken in in what became the United States, and his enslaver is Ezra Stiles, who's a minister who eventually becomes the president of Yale. Um, and this sort of individual is really interesting to me. He's taken into slavery as a child. He lives in slavery in the household of Stiles for decades, and then something happens. And the way Stiles describes it in 1778, as I recall, is that he freed or liberated my man Newport. And it's obvious that Newport partly influenced Stiles to do that. And we know that partly because Newport takes as his last name Freeman, which is, obviously indicative of this status. And his story is really interesting. He ends up marrying another formerly enslaved person, a woman named Violet, and they have a child whom they immediately register as a freed person. So it's very important to them, this freedom. Nevertheless, because of the sort of economic problems of the late 1770s and early 1780s, it's a time of terrible inflation, currency devaluation, and really tough times for a lot of people. They end up actually putting their son and themselves as servants, as indentured servants, back to Styles, almost, but not quite, enslaving their son for 20 years. They has a period of indenture until he's an adult. And that it sort of shows the sort of complications, the way that obviously freedom and liberty take on really great significance for many people, partly because of the palpable and ubiquitous nature of slavery in all of the colonies, including New England, but also thinking about the sort of complications, the sort of economic exigencies, the sort of challenges of economic inequalities, even as there's an idea of sort of human equality. And those are some of the sort of issues that I try to deal with. And that was one of the stories that was just became really fascinating to me.
Absolutely. So this is kind of piggyback on this question, and I usually ask this question of my guests as you're doing this research, which takes a long time to do this
Yes,
research.
it does.
Um, you know, there's usually moments when you kind of stop and you're like, you come across something where you're like, this is why I'm doing this. Like it almost justifies it to you, and you become
Mhm,
not just an author or historian, but you become a fan of history. You just came
mhm,
across a piece of something that you're
mhm.
like, oh, this is cool. I'm gonna share this at the dinner table.
Yeah.
I do that even though nobody cares, but I say it anyway. The moment of like, that's why I love history. That's why I'm doing this.
Mhm.
Can you think of a moment that might have happened during this process?
Oh, I mean, again, there were many moments. Partly I was obviously really guided by the secondary work of other amazing historians who've written all kinds of wonderful books and articles about the American Revolution in various ways and sort of topics related to it. But I am an archive rat, so I often, where I could, I tried to find the original material that they had sort of based their claims on. And I did a fair bit of archival research, especially in the US, Great Britain, and France, which are languages I can manage. Unfortunately, some others I had to really rely on translated material. But um, one of the things I discovered in doing that was that there was actually a case for sexual assault in Long Island in 1776. And this is a case that other historians had written about. And it's kind of a remarkable case because the woman who brings the charge of this assault is successful in her claim, and 2 British soldiers who, had apparently raped her, and when asked about this, dismissed this by saying she was a Yankee whore or a Yankee bitch, and it didn't really matter, even if they had done it, although they denied doing it. Um, they are actually executed for this rape. And this is quite surprising in the 18th century. It's pretty unusual for especially rape cases against white men to be taken this seriously. And what I discovered in the archives is that, in fact, initially the military court had found in favor of the soldiers, was going to exonerate the soldiers until General Howe himself, who was in charge of British forces, intervened and told the court to change their verdict. This was a prerogative that the sort of top general had for British military courts at this period. Soldiers had no right of appeal based on whatever decision. And it was clear to me that he did this because he worried this woman, the woman who was assaulted, was a widow of a Continental Army soldier. She was a mother with 2 children. She was also in an area where they had also British soldiers had also, plundered households, and there was a sort of sense of an impending public relations disaster for the British, and how basically made them change the verdict in order to, show that the British military was unwilling to accept this kind of mistreatment of Americans. And that is quite extraordinary. He literally found his signature signing off on the verdict that led to the hanging, the execution of these 2 men. And that was quite, it was kind of a chilling moment to find that. It was just a really unexpected, and none of the work that had been done seems to have kind of clocked that intervention. And that to me was really interesting in thinking about, especially British sort of public relations management in this period, and what the sort of ramifications of that were. So that was really, like, to me, an amazing discovery in the archive.
Yeah, no, talk about chilling discovery. Like that's you're right. That's one of those moments that like stops you,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Isn't it amazing? There's so many things that are sitting away in these folders, these blue, teal folders,
There are. There
and as they
sure are.
bring it over to you and they bring you the gloves and and you're just like, first, if I'm opening this up and I'm thinking to myself, when was the last time someone opened this before me? And
Mhm,
when will there be
mhm.
another time that
I
someone will
know,
open this before me, right? And
I
like
know.
so many things are undiscovered, even though they're right there.
I know, it's really amazing, and to me, I mean, there were times when, it would have been a lot faster to do this without those sort of archival trips and, working through manuscript material, is challenging, especially sometimes not in English, is challenging, but also just like extraordinarily rewarding and to me worth it because you find things like this that you don't expect and that you wouldn't know from just reading this sort of secondary work and to sort of find your way to that is really quite amazing.
Absolutely. Sarah, this was a great conversation. I highly recommend the book. I think it
Oh,
does an
thank
awesome
you.
job of, like I said, zooming in at individual people and then zooming out at the whole, and then zooming back in and zooming back out. I feel like some of my authors lately have been doing that, and it's such an amazing way for readers that makes this book very accessible to not just academics, but it makes it accessible to just a person that says, I like history, or I want to know how we got here. We're celebrating the 250th. I want to know what that means. And
Mhm.
I feel like if someone says, I want to know what that means, I would tell them, start with freedom around the globe.
Oh,
And
well,
that's
that's
what I would
so
say.
kind. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you and I did really try to write it so that it would be accessible to people of all
Love it.
stripes around the world. So I hope that I'm really delighted to hear that you found it to be so.
Absolutely. Sarah, thank you so much for spending your time.
Thank you. Take care.